teacher asks your kids for prayer requests or asks them a question, right? Right? Keep everything a secret until then. So I hope you're not cringing. I'm really not listening. Actually, I am. So the question that I wanted to just kind of throw out there this morning to kind of get you primed for the sermon is, what kind of sin would it take for God to just drop down some fire and burn a bunch of us up? I mean, really, what kind of sin would it take for God to just immediately just bring a little judgment, and I'm talking about real judgment, and just disintegrate some of us? So I thought of a few things, things that happened in the Old Testament in the past. Obviously, would it be sexual immorality along the lines of Sodom and Gomorrah? And, there's that rampant immorality that we got to that point that God would rain down a little fire and brimstone, which he did to them during that day. How about last Wednesday night, we studied about Noah. We studied about the times of Noah and how it just talked about how the world was filled with violence and with people just, every thought of their heart was evil. Every intent of their heart was evil. So would it be if we all just had these evil intentions and violent, that God would then send some destruction, and which he did at that time? But there's another thing that prompted some judgment from God that we're going to look at this morning in Numbers chapter 11. And it might surprise you just a little bit, because you know what it was? It was a spirit. Really, it wasn't even the spirit. I'm calling it the spirit in my sermon. But it was grumbling. It was the spirit of grumbling and the spirit of complaining. This is pretty appropriate for churches. No, not for us, of course, but for most, they should tune in. No. Listen, Numbers chapter 11, I'm going to read the first 3 verses at this point, and then pick up and read the rest. It says, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Actually, I'm just going to stop right there for a little bit. So they're complaining and they're grumbling, angered God to the point that he just dropped down a little bit of fire, and those who were out there, it says on the outskirts of the camp, he just did away with a few of them. Take that. Just for a little bit of grumbling, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. Here's what I really want you to know, and here's what I really want to say. And I do want to establish this fact, but I want to do it in the right way. Grumbling, well, gosh, where do I even want to start? It sounded good in my mind when I was thinking about it. God is displeased with the grumbling and complaining of his people. So displeased with the grumbling and complaining of his people that, and again, I kind of did a little slip there in the beginning, and I said a spirit of grumbling. You see, what we're going to see here is this wasn't like they just had a complaint and they made a complaint. This was a spirit that began to permeate them, and it began to permeate all of them. In fact, we're going to see it. You can see it chapters 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14. In every one of those chapters, there are things that happen that they just mumbling, complaining, griping, grumbling, murmuring against God, grumbling against Moses. It's just a spirit that has just completely gone through them and taken over them. And that's what's really happening here. So it's not like just you have a little complaint about something, but it's this attitude and this spirit that just sort of takes over you. Now, I want to say this, and I really want to say it, because I know personally that, I know that in a church, and I was thinking about some firsthand personal knowledge that I have, and I know that a church can have a church leader that is and I'm just going to say it, that's really not even called to be a church leader and really not even called to be a pastor. And that I know how much destruction that can bring upon the church body. All right, so I get that. And so what I'm saying today is not that you just have to blindly acquiesce to everything that a church leader wants you to do. I'm not saying that. But there's a way to approach that. And there's a way to not approach that. And the way to not approach that is through a spirit of grumbling and complaining. It would take people full of the Spirit and wisdom, and this is really getting to the later part of this, that would unite together in the church body, and the church body would make a decision about what was right. So I get that. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about this spirit that can permeate a church body, and it can just be a spirit of grumbling and a spirit of complaining. And it is not what God wants. It is not along God's lines. Let's look at Jude verse 16. Jude, little one-page book right before Revelation. Verse 16, he says this. He's talking about apostates, and he's talking about people who are not following God. And he says, listen to verse 16. He says, these are grumblers and complainers, walking according to their own lusts, and they mouth great swelling words, flattering people to great gain. So this whole little book, which is only one chapter here, is talking about the end. It's talking about the judgment of God. It's talking about the people who are falling away. And he says these are the ones who are grumblers and complainers. James chapter 5 verse 9. James chapter 5 verse 9 says this. He says, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. He says, if you grumble against each other, he said, if you're complaining against each other, that you're gonna find yourself in judgment. Listen, over in Numbers, they certainly found themselves in judgment. The fire fell down. And so I just want you to know that this is still the case today. Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, and I know what this verse says. This says, do everything without grumbling and without complaining. 2:14, do all things without complaining and disputing. And it could be without grumbling and complaining. Do the things that you do in serving the Lord, and serve the Lord and serve God through His church without grumbling, without complaining, without griping, without all that kind of stuff. You're just going to enjoy this sermon today, aren't you? I think it's going to get better. I'm just establishing the fact that this spirit of grumbling and this spirit of complaining is not pleasing to God. In fact, it's contrary to God's word, and it's contrary to God's will, and it's contrary to God's way. So one last verse, 1 Corinthians 10, 9 and 10. So he says, don't let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by the serpents. This is a story we're going to come upon later in the book of Numbers about how they were complaining against God. They tempted God, and God sent a bunch of serpents to bite them and kill them. And then verse 10, it says, nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. This verse is possibly a reference to what we're looking at today in Numbers chapter 11. Verse 11 there says, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. You see, here's the deal. Let's talk about complaining and grumbling just a little bit. Complaining and grumbling just a little bit is actually, it's despising the things of God. All right? It really is. It comes from a heart of unbelief. It's despising the things of God. It's despising what God is doing. I want you to think about this just for a second. These people, the children of Israel, as they stood right here in Numbers chapter 11, they were a people who had been called by God. They had been set aside for God's purposes. And not only had they been called and set aside for God's purposes, but then He had, with a mighty show of power, He had delivered them from oppression, right? They were slaves for hundreds of years in Egypt. And He, through a mighty show of power, through all of those plagues that you remember, He delivered them, and he set them free. And he gave them promises. And he said, I'm going to take you into the promised land. And as long as you walk with me, and as long as you walk in my ways, my blessing is going to be poured out upon you. So he called them, he delivered them, he gave them promises. And you know what they did? They just sneered at it. He gave them a destiny. He said, I'm going to take you to the promised land. I've set you free. They turned their back on it. We're going to see specifically in a minute. But complaining is really saying that I really don't care what God is doing. And I really don't care what God is trying to do. And I really don't care what God wants to do if it's not being done in a way that makes me happy. Esau. Think about Esau. All right. There's a verse I want to read. Hebrews chapter 12. I think it's about verse 15. Hebrews chapter 12, starting verse 15, he says, be careful, or looking carefully, lest any one of you fall short of the grace of God, lest a root of bitterness spring up in you, causing trouble, and by this many become defiled. Remember that verse. I'm going to come to it later. He says, unless there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. So I want to use Esau as this example of this profane person, of this person who despised the things of God, who was a person who didn't really care about what God was doing. So if you remember Esau, does anybody remember I almost gave it away. Does anybody remember who Esau's father was? No. I almost gave it away and tricked you. I tricked you. Somebody else say it. Somebody said it over here. Nope, not Isaac. Isaac was his grandpa. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I'm wrong. You're right. Your dog's Isaac. Okay. So Esau is Jacob's brother, and their father is Isaac. So who's Isaac's father? Which means who would be Esau's grandfather? Abraham. So Esau's grandfather is Abraham. Esau's father is Isaac. Now here's what I'm doing here. The promise, the very first promise about the nation of Israel being a great people and having a land to live in was given to whom? Who was the first person that God gave that promise to? Abraham. Esau's grandfather. God called Abraham and said, I want you to come out from your people. You're going to go to a land. It's a land that I'm going to give to your people. Your descendants are going to be like the sand on the seashore. Your descendants are going to be like the stars in heaven. And this is your destiny, and this is what I'm going to do for you. And so then that was passed on through which son of Abraham? It's not a trick question. Isaac. Thank you. So it's passed on through Isaac. And again, this promise that God gave to Abraham is passed on through the son of promise, who is Isaac. So it's going to be from the sons of Isaac, or from the lineage of Isaac, that this promise is going to be fulfilled, that there's going to make them a great nation, more than the sands on the seashore, more than the stars in heaven. He's going to take them to the promised land, and he's going to give it to them. So two of Isaac then had two sons, two twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the oldest. Now, I'm not going to get into too much. I'm not going to get into it all that Jacob was really the one chosen by God. Here's the point that I want to make from a cultural perspective. Esau was the oldest son of Isaac. The lineage is supposed to pass through Esau. It's supposed to go through Esau. You cannot tell me that you are the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham, and you don't know what that means. He absolutely knew what it meant. It meant that through his heritage that God was going to use to make a great people, a great nation, and God was going to bring them to a land of promise. And that promise was to pass through him. You can't tell me, as the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac, he didn't clearly understand that. But he was out hunting one day. And he got real hungry. And he came home. And Jacob had a big old pot of gumbo on the stove. Probably wasn't gumbo. But it's probably real similar to gumbo. He had a big old pot of stew on the stove. And Esau said, ooh, man, that sure does smell good. He said, why don't you dish me up a bowl of that stew and bring it to me? And Jacob said, I'll tell you what. If you give me the birthright, I'll give you a bowl of this stew. Now understand, that with everything that I just said, what he's weighing out. A bowl of stew traded for being the lineage and the line through which God would fulfill his promise of a great nation and their destiny into the promised land. Or a bowl of stew. Which one do I want? Which one did he choose? He chose the bowl of stew. And that's why the writer of Hebrews would call him a profane person. You see, Esau, he didn't care about what God was doing. He didn't care about what God wanted to do. He didn't care about if there was a promise and a destiny. And what happens is when we begin to complain and grumble against God and against the ways of God and the things of God and the things that God is doing, it's because we have turned our back upon the promise of God. No, we have turned our back upon the plan of God and the purpose of God. And we have forgotten even what God is trying to do. And one of the main things that we need to do before in our own particular small church body right here is we need to remember why we are here. We are here to represent God to our community, to be a light to our community for God. We are here to be an emergency room for those who are hurting and those who are dying. We are here to participate with God in his purpose to reach our community with the salvation of his Son, Jesus Christ. That's why we are here. And when we start bickering and backbiting and having bitterness and this spirit of complaining and grumbling takes over us, we have lost sight of that. We have completely and totally lost sight of that. It's really, you could almost say it's a sign of unbelief. It's a sign that I don't really believe that's what God's doing. How could Esau really believe and then just say, I'll take a bowl of stew? I like stew. But I'm not giving up my inheritance for it. How about you? Right? I'm not giving up my spiritual inheritance for it, that's for sure. The thing about this spirit of grumbling, and I'm going to start using that phrase now, spirit of grumbling. The thing about this spirit of grumbling is that it is extremely infectious. And over the last few years, we've learned about stuff being infectious, haven't we? We've learned about how quickly something can spread through a community, can spread through a church, can spread through, we've learned about how infectious things can be. The spirit of grumbling is exactly the same. Since you might already be in Hebrews chapter 12, since they have that pulled up there, I'll go ahead and start with that verse. Again, verse 15. He says, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest a root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Now I understand this is talking about a root of bitterness, and I understand that I'm equating it with the thing of grumbling and complaining, but it talks about how many become defiled. We're going to see here that many become defiled even in this spirit of grumbling. Back over to Numbers chapter 11. If you skip down to verse 4. So Numbers chapter 11 verse 4 gives us a specific case, a specific example of the grumbling that took place. It says, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Now, hold on to that just for a second. But what I want you to notice, first of all, it says that it started with this mixed multitude. That's where it started. And then after that, it was then all the children of Israel wept again. It spread from a few, it spread into the many. Now, if you did a little research on this mixed multitude, I don't know. They were obviously people who were not assimilated. Some other translations might even translate that as riffraff. Is one of the translations that I ran across. It was just people who were not assimilated. They might even been not really Hebrew people, but had just kind of stumbled upon them as they were there at Mount Sinai. They might even have been some slaves in Egypt who were not Hebrews, but upon that deliverance, they might have just said, hey, I'm going too. You know, we got a jailbreak going here. Let's all get involved in it. They might have been some of that. They were not assimilated true Hebrew people. And the complaining started among them. And then it went to the entire nation until everybody was complaining. And not only that, but I want you to notice something else over to verse 11. It even spread to Moses. This is how infectious it was. This is how infectious the spirit of complaining is. This is why you can get caught in this cycle when you have this spirit of complaining. So it comes to verse 11. It says, Moses said to the Lord, why have you afflicted your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight? You have laid the burden of all these people on me. Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them? In other words, did I give them birth? That you should say to me, well, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to your fathers. Where am I supposed to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat so that we may eat meat. I'm not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, then just kill me right here and now if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. Moses became a complainer. You see, the spirit of complaining and the spirit of grumbling puts you in this great, big, huge cycle. It starts in a little corner somewhere of people in the church. And then it spreads to the church. And you're complaining usually about ministries or about the leadership or whatever it is you're complaining about. You're just complaining. Well, the next thing you know, your pastor starts complaining. He doesn't complain to you, but he complains to God about you. He says, God, why don't you just wipe them out? And you get in this vicious cycle where everybody is just complaining and everybody is just unhappy and everybody has got this spirit of grumbling that's going on. And we can't get anywhere if we're caught in this cycle, in this spirit of grumbling, in the spirit of complaining. And we certainly won't be able to participate in the plan and purposes of God in our community if we're caught in this little cycle right here. One of the things that happens with complaining and grumbling is it distorts, it just takes over your heart in such a way that you can't even see things clearly. All right? You really can't. Chapter 11. Back up a little bit to verse 5. So they've asked for meat. We want some meat. And they say, we remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Now, in case you don't really get that, let me try to explain it to you. When they lived in Egypt, they were slaves. When they lived in Egypt, they were slaves and they had harsh taskmasters. They were beaten with the whip if they didn't meet their quota of how much of the pyramid they built that day. They were building the great cities of Pithom and Ramses, according to Exodus. They were enslaved. They were enslaved by harsh taskmasters, and the work was very difficult. But now look what they're saying. We were better off in Egypt because we had watermelon. Then we are out here in the promised land, because in the promised land, all we've got is this manna stuff. Let's read just for a second, starting in verse 7, about what manna was. So manna was like coriander seed, and its color was like the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it. They ground it on millstones or beat it with mortar. They cooked it in pans and they made cakes out of it. And its taste was like the taste of a pastry prepared for oil. When the dew fell on the camp in the night, manna fell with it. So here's what was happening here. Just catch this. God was miraculously feeding these people with heavenly food. Every morning when they woke up and the dew was on the ground, there would be this stuff out there on the ground. And they could go and they could scoop it up and they could put it on their grinding board and they could grind it up and they could make cakes with us. Now, it wasn't like they were being destined to have bread and water for the rest of their lives. In fact, the verse says in verse 8 that it tasted like a pastry. I mean, it's like they were just eating a loaf of bread. Staff meeting one day, Debbie brings these things. They look like egg rolls, but they're filled with apple pie filling. And they got cinnamon all over the outside of them. That was manna, people. It looked like an egg roll, but it tasted like the best apple pie you've ever had in your life, all right? It was manna. I mean, they were complaining. Listen, they were saying, in Egypt, we had it better than living out here, experiencing the miracle of God every single day and being fed with this food that God has for us. In fact, it's in Psalm 78, verse 25. Psalm 78, verse 25 said that the food was actually angels' food. So my vision, their vision had become so distorted. Our vision can become so distorted through this spirit of grumbling that we would rather go back to slavery than to experience the mighty, wonderful, miraculous power of God every day. Our vision can just be, listen, I'm going to use an example. And I've kind of tried to talk myself out of doing this. Let me just warn you up front, okay? I'm going to use y'all as an example. But now, the only reason I dare to use it as an example is because you're way past it. You've gotten way past it, okay? You understand what I'm saying? But it is an example that I saw right here in this church. That is just the perfect example of how the spirit of grumbling had taken over the entire church, and it had caused you to be distorted. It caused you to have a distorted view of godly spiritual things. So I first came here February 2019. So it's been a little over 3 years that I came here to preach my first little sermon, not as your pastor, but the first one was just as a fill-in, right? So in February 2019, a little over 3 years ago, I first came here. It was my first Sunday here. And you guys were having an argument at that time. And you know what it was about? I don't know if you remember this or not. Y'all, it was about prayer. Are you hearing what I'm saying? The spirit of grumbling had so overcome you that you were having a dispute about prayer. About whether or not people should be called down to the altar and prayed over or pray or whatever. It didn't matter. You were arguing about prayer. I wanted to just stand up here and say, people, open your eyes. I didn't have to say it like that. You got past it. You went past it. But listen, what does it matter about prayer? What does it matter if you pray at the altar or pray in the shower? If your heart is truly praying, what does it matter? Look, if you feel like you need to pray at the altar, you better run down here and fall on your face and pray at the altar. If you want to pray where you are, then you stay where you are and you pray. If you want to pray in your car, it doesn't matter. It's prayer. It's prayer. When the heart is in prayer, when the heart is crying out to God, that's the only thing that matters. But the spirit of grumbling had so overtaken the entire church that you couldn't even see it, and you were having a dispute about prayer. Now, which side was right? Let me tell you this. Both sides were wrong. Both sides were wrong. Well, we have to do this. No, you don't. Well, we can't do this. Yes, you can. Whatever God puts in your heart. Anyhow, I expounded on that a little more than I wanted to. But it's the perfect example of how the spirit of grumbling, it caused them to want to go back to being slaves in Egypt because they had cucumbers there, instead of being out here in the wilderness experiencing the miracles of God every day and eating apple pie every day. I guess if you ate apple pie every day, I guess it would get up. I don't know. It tasted like a pastry. The spirit of grumbling distorts our view, and it distorts what we can see. And listen, it brings the judgment of God. We saw in verse 1 that complaining, the fire fell down and burned up a bunch of them out there on the outskirts. So let me read the rest of this, or some of it anyhow. So their complaint at this point is they want some meat. They want some meat to eat. They don't want this manna anymore. They want some meat. So starting in verse 18, so after Moses has said, "What are you doing to me, God? And just kill me right now if this is the way it's going to be." So God answers Moses, and in verse 18 he says, "Say to the people, consecrate yourselves tomorrow." Actually, that's really not where I want to pick it up at. I could pick it up right there, but I think where I really want to pick it up is somewhere around verse 31. No, golly, I do want to back up a little bit. Let me just go back to verse 18. "So then you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? The Lord saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it is well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat. Not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10 days, not 20 days, but for a whole month, until it starts coming out of your nostrils and it becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and you have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come out of Egypt?" So God says, you know what? I'm going to give you exactly what you want. You want some meat? You're going to have meat. You're going to have meat till you're sick of it. You're going to have meat till it's coming out of your nose. You're going to have meat because you have despised what I'm doing, which we talked about a little bit ago. Because you have despised the Lord and the things of God, I'm going to give you exactly what you want. This is another little just aside. Just because you want it and just because you get it doesn't mean it was God's will. Whoops. Just because you want it and just because you get it doesn't mean it was God's will. God gave them what they wanted, but he gave them a judgment that comes with it. Skip now to verse 31. It says, "A wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and it left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and about a day's journey on the other side, and all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground." This wind blew in quail. They were stacked up. They were all over the ground. The people stayed up all that day and all night and all the next day, and they gathered the quail, and he who gathered the least had 10 omers, had a lot, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was even chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So while they were started chewing, they had it all roasted up, barbecued, grilled, however they wanted to have it. They took their first bite, they started eating it. While the meat was still stuck between their teeth, it says that God sent a great plague upon them. Listen, this spirit of murmuring that causes you to not be able to see the true spiritual things, that causes you to truly despise the things of God and the things that he are doing, will lead you to a place of judgment. In verses 1, he sent down fire that burned up a bunch on the outskirts. And here in verses 31 and following, he sent plague among them, and he sent a bunch of sores upon them. You see, here's the deal. It's me-centered. Now, what if God doesn't send you what if God doesn't just drop fire down? What if he doesn't just send a bunch of boils on you? Psalm 106 verse 15. Psalm 106 verse 15 is actually making reference to this exact incident. And here's what it said. I think it said, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm going to read it. It says, he gave them their request, but he sent leanness to their soul. It's talking about this exact incident where they wanted quail, and it said that he gave them their request, but he sent leanness to your soul. What if in your complaint, God gives you exactly what you want physically, but in your spirit, you begin to dry up? What if he gives you exactly what you want in the physical realm and in the world realm and in the realm that looks at me? What if he gives you exactly what you want, but in the spiritual realm, there is a leanness to your spirit and a leanness to your soul? What if that happens? Be careful what you're complaining about, because you just might get it. You just might get it. And it may not be exactly what you think it is. So what do we do? Do I have time? I don't, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Because I can't. That's too negative. I can't just leave you with that. All right, so what do we do? First thing we have to do is you need to become a prayer intercessor. I'll go through these fast. You need to be an intercessor of prayer. I told you that even Moses got caught up in this after the verse 4. Even Moses got caught up in it. But in the first 3 verses in that event, we see something different out of Moses. In verse 2, it says, the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire was quenched. Moses interceded to God on behalf of the people, and God didn't send his judgment down, or it stopped the judgment, it stopped the fire from coming. What you need to do is you need to become an intercessor. You need to become someone who's praying for this church. You need to become someone who is lifting up your Sunday school teachers, your deacons, your staff. You need to lift up the other members of this church. Listen, I'm going to tell you what, if you're interceding for this church, you're probably not going to be trying to do damage to this church. It's the old saying, the people that are rowing the boat are not rocking the boat, and the people that are rocking the boat are generally not the ones who are rowing the boat. All right, so either start rowing. I don't want to say or start rocking because I don't want you to start rocking. But you understand the point. Start rowing, and one of the ways that you can start rowing is by interceding like Moses did and interceding to God on behalf of us. The next thing we have to do is you need to learn how to forgive. You need to learn how to find forgiveness in your heart. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 says this. It says, bear with one another, forgiving one another if anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. If you have a complaint against another person, if you have a grumble, a gripe against another person, what you need to do is you need to find in your heart a way to forgive that other person. You need to find spiritually the avenue through which you can let that go and through which you can forgive. Or it's going to become that root of bitterness that we read about in Hebrews that's going to begin to defile you, and then it's going to spread through the entire congregation, and it's going to defile others. We need to find, at the first signs of this spirit of grumbling that may come along, we need to find our way of forgiving other people. So, 2 other verses, Acts chapter 6, and there's a verse in Ephesians 4:3 that talks about protecting the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Acts chapter 6 is actually, in my opinion, a chapter about the first deacons. And the reason I'm using it is because it started with a complaint. It started with a grumble. There was a grumble against these 2 different kinds of Hebrew people. Some were Hellenists and some were... So the Hellenists would be the Greek Jews, and the others would be the Jews, the Hebrew Jews. And there was a complaint that the Hellenists thought that their widows were being left out whenever the ministry of the church took place. So the answer to that was, choose 7 men who are among you. Choose some men who are among you who are full of the Holy Spirit and of wisdom. And these men will take care of that for you. Here's something that needs to happen. Our godly people, those people who seek the Lord, I said this a little bit early on in dealing with a bad situation. These are, and in my opinion, this is the first deacons, in my opinion. You can debate that or not. So they choose 7 men, and they're full of the Holy Spirit. They're full of wisdom. So these men, these spiritual leaders, these deacons, they need to be spiritually minded to start out with. They need to be people who are I'm trying to make up a word, so I better stop. Who are intercessory prayers, praying for the church body, so that when this thing begins, they are actually, with a spirit of wisdom and with the power of the Holy Spirit, they are actually able to address it and do whatever needs to be done in order to see it stop. Instead of being just like the preachers, just like Moses, and let us all just get swept up into this thing. And we need to be, Ephesians 4:3, that verse says that we need to endeavor to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. I think that's the way it says it, right? To keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. One of our goals as a people of God needs to be unity. Needs to be a unity of the people of God. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ever disagree with somebody else. Again, this is not, I have a complaint. This is a spirit of grumbling and murmuring and complaining that takes over and begins to become infectious. Stand up with me if you would. Now, look, it was actually pretty easy to preach that sermon because that's not where we are right now. All right? I'm not just saying that, I mean that. That's not where we are as a church body. But here's the deal. We'd better be on guard so that we don't get to that place. So that we don't let a spirit of grumbling and complaining take over. And if I find it starting in my heart, I need to address it. And if you find it starting in your heart, you need to address it. It's us despising what God is trying to do here. It'll distort our vision so that we can't even see what's really the truth and what's really happening. God's purpose for this church is to reach this community with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we want to preserve the unity of the Spirit so that that is never hindered and never thwarted, because that is the main thing. I don't know what you may need to do today. I don't know how the Spirit of the Lord has been working in your life recently, but whatever you need to do today, if you need to make a public decision for Christ, you can do it right now while we sing. If you want to come and kneel at the altar, you are welcome to come and kneel at the altar. If you do not feel led to come and kneel at the altar, I in no way think you're less than one who does. It's completely and totally what God puts into your heart. You pray today. You open up your heart and let God have His way. Let's pray. You come. Let's sing.